Section 7 of Irish Idylls by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 7. Ody spoke with sincere conviction and a wonted authoritativeness, which did not fail to impress Stacey, and through many succeeding days she clung to the colour sergeant hypothesis as desperately as if it had been a life buoy instead of a straw. In the long dark evenings, when it was too cold to lie down away from the fire on the puddly floor, and in the bleak mornings, when life walking up found naught the answer persistently elicited by computations of happiness in prospect, a result which 18 years old is prone to regard as a reductio ad impossibile, Stacey sometimes shut out intrusive despairs with the help of Ody's glowing picture. Only it invariably happened that the martial figure, flaring and glittering along the bog road, turned before he came very near into just Dan himself in his old scarecrow tatters, without any splendour or brilliancy at all. She had much need, in truth, of whatever cheering figments either faith or fancy could frame, for this winter was a pitiless season in Lisconnel and its inhabitants. One December night they all shivered sorely in their lairs of heather and rags, as if the breath of a bitter frost were abroad. Still in the morning no traces of such were visible, unless you noticed that the lingering brier and bracken leaves seemed suddenly to have been dipped in fiery vivid scarlet and orange. But when the potatoes for the next meal were gathered, faces lengthened and heads shook, for experienced eyes at once recognised signs of a frost-biting that must entail a serious shrinkage of estimated supplies. And soon after that they began to draw omens from the flights of birds, flocks, mainly of seagulls, small and great, who came swooping over the murk of the bog, lighting on it in patches of foam, scattered momentarily in a flickering of white wings as they fled on further inland. Herons, too, passed heavily and gloomily flapping and croaking, and long trains of wild duck scudding by like trails of smoke that knew where it was going, till they dwindled into blurred pencil marks on the horizon. All these, if they did not exactly belong to the nation of unfortunate and fatal birds, were watched coming and going by foreboding eyes as the harbingers of powerful severe weather, when they do be that plinty. And sure enough, before Christmas there was deep snow. It came wavering across the bogland on a northwest wind, and lay strewn at first in handfuls and then in armfuls, till at last a huge lead-coloured cloud appeared to shatter itself sheer over Lisconnel, like as if, to quote Pat Ryan, you were crumbling a soft clod of clay between your two hands. And thenceforward all was one blank of white, only broken here and there by the black mouth of a bog hole. Even these filled eventually, as the water in them froze hard, and made of each a secret resting place for the whirling drifts, pitfalls into one of which the Quigley's fawn-coloured goat floundered down, poor wretch, to her smothering death. For the snow was accompanied by such a biting frost as seldom grips Lisconnel, and the tiny dry flakes and granules seemed to be ground fine and driven in tangible mists of stinging dust on the wide wailing storm. It's a good chanst we're gettin' to understand the sayin', when you see the snow like salt and mail, your food and fire be apt to fail. Brian Kilfoyle said one day, ruefully kicking at a glittering powdery drift which had sifted under the Doynes' rickety door into their house, where he was talking to Stacey and her mother. Brian, who is normally a big burly man at that time, had assumed, in common with his neighbours, the aspect of an incomplete structure, a framework with much filling out left to do. "It's 7 weeks lyin' on us now since Christmas, and here's Candlemas wid nary a sign of the change yit. But I'm glad to see you houldin' up so well agin it, ma'am." "Och, indeed, I'm keepin' iligant and grand, thank God," said Mrs. Doyne, nervously fingering the largest hole in her frayed out apron. "But as for Stacey there, the crathur, her face this minute isn't the breadth of the palm of me hand. The two eyes of her'll prisintly be runnin' into one." Stacey shrank further into the background at the sound of her own name, and Brian Kilfoyle said, "Ah, sure, young things like her do be aisy perished, aye, and the ould people too. There's me poor mother, she and little Jim, since the bad turn he took a while ago, they don't seem to have an atom of warmth left in them. Scarce a wink they sleep at night wid the cold, though we do give them every rag we can contrive. Our hearts are fairly broke wid them. For me mother, if we don't mind her, will be slippin' the wisp of an ould cloak off her onto one of the childer and gettin' her death. And that Jim does be creepin' from one to the other like a lost dog at a fair, tryin' for a taste of heat somewheres. The misfort'nit little spalpeen, his hands grabbin' you to be just dabs of ice, but divil a thraneen more have we got to put on them." There was a painful pause, and then Mrs. Doyne said apologetically, "I wish to goodness gracious, Brian, I could offer you the loan of e'er an ould wrap, but indeed it's hard set we are, man, to keep the life from freezin' stiff in ourselves these times, wid the most we've got." To be sure, ma'am," Brian said in hurried deprecation. "How would you? Sure we must all shift for ourselves the best way we can, and we'll do right enough onst this blamed black frost quits a hould." Brian had now carried out the purpose of his call, but he could not betray the fact by immediate departure, so he lingered gossiping in the doorway. "Big Anne's sleepin' up at Widdy M'Gurk's these couple of nights back. Did you hear tell?" he began. "She got that scared and lonesome there be herself she couldn't abide it. For Mad Bell was, as we know, absent, and the dummy had been some years dead." "So they were sayin'," said Mrs. Doyne, "but look Brian," lowering her voice solemnly, "div you know was there anythin' special frightened her?" "Well, yes," he answered in a reluctant sort of mumble, "a foot goin' up and down along be her door, and nobody on the road, and somethin' that shook the latch and let a keen, and never a breath of wind stirrin'. Leastwise that's the story she has. But just you tell me how many nights in the year there is widout a waft of wind goin' through it. And as for them bastes of goats, times and again I've mistook a one of them pattin' by for somethin' in brogues." Howsomever, what fairly terrified her was a voice that kept callin' "Anne, Big Anne," imitating first one neighbour and then another, and different in a manner from them all. She says 'twas such hijeous clare moonlight she dursn't look out, and she lay in a cold tremble till the mornin', listenin' to a tappin' on the window. She'd stopped up the pane wid her old saucepan lid, for 'fraid she might see somethin' that was rattlin' belike. "Saints shield us around," said Mrs. Doyne, crossing herself. "We'd be well put off if there was nothin' worse than saucepan rattlin'. You've heard tell what happened young Mick Ryan about Holy Eve, when he'd a crib set for snipe be the river?" Brian only said, "Aye, aye," uninvitingly, but she could not forego the recital. "Just lifted a basket he was, when he looked up, and if there wasn't one of them standin' on the opposite bank right front of him, wid only the flow of the bit of stream between them, and the other comin' jiggin' over along the strip of field not a stone's throw off. Troth, poor Mick thought he couldn't get his heels out of it fast enough. I wonder he didn't lose his wits for good. When he fetched home, his people thought he was blind drunk. Och, mercy, what at all's yon out there, Brian?" She interrupted herself, suddenly clutching him by the arm and pointing through the open door. Far out upon the blanched waste something there was, moving dimly in the thickened light of the gloaming, but whether the form of man or beast, or of neither, could not be told. Brian, without speaking, went a step outside, and seemed to measure the distance which intervened between his own door and the place where he stood. "It's just merely one of the goats traipsing around," he said. Then he made a plunge and rushed towards his cabin across the clogging snow, stumbling and tripping in a headlong haste for which there was nothing apparent to account. Mrs. Doyne banged and bolted the door behind him, and when, long afterwards, her two sons came home, they were obliged to kick and shake it for some time, with much strong language uttered in unmistakably familiar tones, before courage enough was screwed up inside to give them admission. On the next morning, Mrs. Doyne, coming in with an icicle-fringed bucket, sustained another shock of a different kind. Stacey was sitting with folds of brown stuff spread about her, and with needle and thread in hand. It was the material got for her wedding gown, cut out by Biddy Ryan, who is queer and cute about such things, and partially sewn together by Stacey's mother before the day when the girl had passionately implored that it might be put away out of her sight, since when it was lain hidden underneath the dresser. "I was considerin' the skirt would make a little sort of frock like for the Kilfoyles' Jim," Stacey said in explanation. "'Tis bad to be thinkin' of the bit of an imp perishin' all night. Then the len'th of grey holland 'ud make a petticoat might help to keep the life in old Mrs. Kilfoyle. I'd be sorry anything took her." The old woman had soothed Stacey's spirit by expressing confidence in the honesty of Dan. "And there'll be enough wincy left yit to riddy up a body for your ugly old self." "Och, honey, but supposin' you might be wantin' it one of these days after all," said Mrs. Doyne, unable to refrain from a protest against this implied abandonment of hope. "Niver a want I'll want it," said Stacey. "He's dead and gone, Mother Jewel. 'Tis a sin to lave it lyin' up. There's a beautiful warmth in it, and I've set me mind on it uncommon." So Mrs. Doyne assented, as she would to most things upon which Stacey, with her great wistful eyes, had set her mind. This acquiescence, however, not barring sundry bitter thoughts of a Dan hypothetically in the land of the living. Stacey sewed hard all day, with horrible gobble stitches, it must be owned, for her education had been sadly neglected in many of its branches. Besides which, the cold would scarcely let her hold the needle. By the time the daylight failed, she had finished two very quaint garments, whose cut would not bear criticism, but warm and stout of fabric. She felt impatient to convey them to the Kilfoyles, yet as she looked out over the gleaming snow, which had drawn all the light down out of the blank sky, some uncanny thoughts came before her mind so vividly that she shrank from traversing even those few rods of ground alone, and she determined to wait until her brothers came in. But as the evening wore on and they did not arrive, she grew more and more fidgety. It would be a cruel pity to let Jim freeze through another whole night. His small cold hands seemed to keep dragging her towards the door, and at last she said to herself that she would chance it. Maybe there wasn't a word of truth in them quare stories all the while. She'd never seen aught. Watching her time, therefore, she stole out unobserved with her bundle into the moonlight. She wished it had not been so bright. Just to run on blindly through dark shadows, which kept discreetly hidden whatever unchancy objects they might hold, would have seemed easier than to face that broad white glare, where anything dreadful would be seen so very plainly. The rush was made, however, without incident, and then Stacey sped out of the Kilfoyles' cabin almost as precipitately as she had sped into it, running away from the bewildered gratitude of its inhabitants, and the importunate memories and contrasts which this final disposition of her wedding gear did not fail to arouse. But when she had gone only a few paces from their door, a sudden panic seized her. She was compelled by a sort of irresistible fascination to look fearfully round over the wilds that lay stark about and about her, as solitary as the unfathomed blue-black deeps, with their frost-burnished full moon and light-drowned star-flecks. Wafts of wind came murmuring from the far distance, here and there sweeping up a whirl of powdery flakes, as if some one lifted a corner of the great white sheet and let it fall again in a rumpled fold. The wind, of course, was full of sighs and voices, and shadows wavered and flitted on the snow. How could she tell what they might be? Suppose she should meet that strange little crying child, whom people said sometimes ran after them when they were late abroad on the bog, or the limping old woman who laughs in your face as she goes by. Terror whirled through Stacey's thoughts like an autumn gust among a drift of fallen leaves. She began to dart along as fast as the deep snow, a nightmare-like drag, would permit, and she kept her eyes fixed desperately on the track she trod in. Quite near her own door, however, she had to slacken her pace, because across her path stretched two furrow-shaped snowdrifts, into whose ungauged depths she dared not plunge her bare foot. And as she paused a moment irresolute, a voice close by spoke abruptly. "You'll have to get over them," it said, "in standing leaps, as the devil went through Athlone." Stacey did not scream or fly, for she knew the voice, and it was one which would have reassured her in the teeth of a North American blizzard, or the heart of a West Indian cyclone. "So it's yourself, Dan," she said. Dan O'Beirne it was, a tall, gaunt, ragged figure, standing up blackly just beyond the sharp-cut shadow of the Doynes' cabin wall. "Aye, 'tis so," he said, with an anxious hurry in his manner. "And are you thinking entirely too bad of me, Stacey, that I stayed away so long? And you not hearing a word, I'm told, except the letter I sent be Paddy Loughlin, the Sturcawn, that you never got? Meself it is, sure enough, and pounds and somethin' I stopped to get you up at Larne, only there's the use of one hand mostly destroyed on me, and I dunno, tellin' you the truth, if I iver walk any better than a trifle lame wid me left foot. Just a trifle. Och, but Stacey, asthore, maybe you'd liefer have nought to say to such an old bosthoon of misery." "Sure it's all one," said Stacey, "why you stayed away, since it's home you are agin, and the sorra a much I'd be mindin' if you hadn't a hand or a foot left on you at all. A speech whereof the first clause sounds rather poor-spirited, and the last distinctly unfeeling, but to which Dan took no exception. He could give a more detailed account of himself, however, to less incurious friends, whom he told how, on finishing his engagement at the peat factory, a temptingly lucrative job had lured him over the straits to Scotland, whence he intended to return about Holy Eve, which change of plan he announced in a letter home, confided to one Paddy Loughlin, who proved an unreliable messenger. The truth is that Paddy Cliver and Clane forgot his friend's letter in his own bustle about transmitting his earnings home in postal orders, and getting himself shipped back as a pauper to the most conveniently situated Union, a thrifty, if not strictly legitimate, mode of travelling occasionally adopted by itinerant harvest men. How just before he should have started for home he met with a bad accident while helping to rescue the factory foreman's son out of a whirl of jag-toothed wheels and hissing bands, like so many spiders' webs all set a-goin' by the divil, and had lain for a couple of months crippled in hospital, whence he had sent no word, lest they be fretted thinking he was took for death away from them all. Uncommon kind people ran his account of his experiences there, and everything done as agreeable as they could contrive, barrin' that them doctors would be lookin' in of a mornin' and sayin' that leg had a right to come off to morra, or he'll lose them 2 fingers anyway, as easy and pleasant as if the flesh wasn't creepin' on your bones to hear them. But sure they were intindin' no harm. It's the nature of them to keep choppin' and sawin'. The only wonder is that any one gets out of a place where they do be plenty, wid enough of his body left to hold his soul in. Then how, recovering, unmulcted after all of limb, he had straightway repaired home, bringing with him the pounds and pounds presented to him by the grateful foreman, a suit of clothes much too good to think of wearing, and the promise of permanent employment at Sterry and Lawson's whenever he chose to return. Even so, Dan's homecoming could not be compared for external brilliancy with that of the colour sergeant. Indeed, after the first raptures of restoration had subsided, the elder Dan cast many a regretful glance at the halting gait and sling suspended arm of his tall son, while Ody Rafferty sought to slur over the refutation of his own conjectures by insisting on the fact that if the lad had took off to the most outrageous wars ever was, he'd more likely than not have come out of them with less destruction done on him than might be perceived now. Young Dan's native air seemed, however, to possess very salubrious qualities, and before he had been 3 weeks at home, his step began to regain its firmness and strength, and suppleness returned to his limp wrist and stiffened fingers. His cure was practically complete by the time that the black frost had broken, and the snow had vanished off the bog, leaving only its wraith on the frail blossomed sloe bushes, and the wedding day had come. I met the bridal party proceeding towards the town on Farmer Hilferty's loaned jaunting car, and it struck me that I had never seen so many people at once on any vehicle. I caught a glimpse of Jim Kilfoyle in a queer brown frock sitting on the well, and just as they passed he was saying sternly, "I declare, Biddy Sheridan, if you don't leave holdin' me on, I'll let the greatest old yell you ever heard and terrify the horse." This was a morning in Easter week, and Lady Day in spring too, a coincidence which led the widow M'Gurk to observe that you might meet as good fortune marrying on one Lady Day as another, a happy-go-lucky sentiment which Lisconnel appears disposed to adopt as a piece of local proverbial philosophy. Chapter 9. Backwards and Forwards. Should it be concluded from facts related in the foregoing chapters that truth for truth's sake is rather at a discount in Lisconnel, I can scarcely gainsay the inference. If letting on, romancing a bit, and just humbugging, with a little blarneying and sluthering thrown in, are overstraightly judged, we shall be found in a perilous state. But there is one point on which the veracity of its inhabitants, like that of many other people similarly situated, seems exposed to less warrantable suspicion. It is commonly received opinion that the dwellers in any remote and lonely district are largely responsible for whatever growths of ghostly legend may flourish there. These, although they do not perhaps spring directly from anybody's invention, are, it is held, sedulously fostered and cultivated, and handed down with additions and improvements from generation to generation, who take a sort of pride and pleasure in them. We have all heard how the peasants gather round their hearths on eerie winter evenings, and beguile the time with the recital of marrow-freezing ghost stories, to which they contribute, at any rate, wilfully credulous minds. No doubt this custom does really exist in some places, but I can confidently assert that it is not to be found in Lisconnel, and failing, personal observation, I should venture to think its general prevalence antecedently improbable. People who live their lives in solitary places of the earth, under a rigorous enforcement of all the penalties of Adam, are little likely to hanker after the introduction of any supernatural crooks into their lot. To voluntarily fill the wild blasts wailing round their poor hovels with unearthly shrieks and lamentations, that bid them spend their long night imagining some fear, or beset their fields with prowling phantoms that cause them on their lonely road to walk in doubt and dread. In Lisconnel certainly there is none of the vul decipi. On the contrary, such things are, if accepted at all, accepted under protest. There is a marked tendency to resist the admission of spectres to the hamlet and its purlieus, and to resent any obstinate assertion of their presence. Johnny Ryan, for instance, will fight you any day, supposing you a possible combatant, to uphold his contention that he never saw or heard aught on the bogland quare that it might be an old white goat glimmerin' in a stake of moonlight, or a saygull lettin' a screech goin' by. And a considerable ingenuity is expended in ephemerising uncanny personages and explaining away mysterious appearances. How much of whatever belief in spectral hauntings has survived these critical methods may be the unconscious work of imagination, on which opposition sometimes acts as a stimulus, is of course a different question. You have seen already some traces of its survival. And indeed, if you consult a certain section of the community, you will learn facts which you would, if I am not mistaken, be glad to disprove did you happen to live in Lisconnel. You will hear not only of fearsome wanderers met afield, but of strange forms found cowering by the hearth at home, and stealing away to lurk in dusky nooks, whence no one dares more than surmise their ultimate withdrawal. Of a shadow lying black all day across the threshold, with nothing visible to cast it, but falling ice cold upon whomsoever makes bold to step over it. Of a lame old woman who comes tapping at your door, it may be in the broad noonlight, a harmless seeming old creature you think, until she looks into your eyes and laughs a laugh you will not soon forget the sound of. All the lore, in short, connected with those beings whom Lisconnel terms collectively more or less under its breath, "thim wans." The origin of these visitations now lies obscured in the history of such old unhappy things, that it has come to be narrated in more various ways than I can here recount. But one of our local tragedies, said to be still terribly commemorated, did actually occur within the recollection of anybody who has had the sorrowful fortune to live through the great famine year, that is, some half-century since. It was down at Clayson's Boreen, a few miles along the road towards the town, where a skeleton cabin stands to-day, that a man, driven distraught with the famine fever, barred himself and 3 or 4 small children into their room while the mother went in quest of food. And when she returned with some bread at nightfall through the snow, the poor wretch would not open to her. So all night she beat on the door and called to her crying children, and the next day the whole family were found cold and dead, the father and children in the cabin, and the mother outside, half buried in a drift heaped against the wall, her loaf untouched, and in her hand the stone with which she had been battering the door. The cabin has been ever since deserted, and its doorstep is a ruinous gap. Yet still on many a night, they say, this miserable woman may be seen standing by it, wringing her hands and buffeting the empty air. If you can take to your heels and fly before you have beheld anything more, you will have met with nothing worse than a fright. But if she turns and beckons you to come and help her, you could be given no surer warning of black troubles in store. This is just what did befall Brian Kilfoyle one spring evening not long after young Dan's wedding, on his dusky way home from O'Beirne's forge with a mended loy. Brian's belief in ghostly manifestations is, as a rule, waveringly reluctant, and he would probably soon have reasoned himself into a conviction that he was only after mistaking something in the darkness of the light, had not his mood been already downcast and foreboding on account of his mother's failing health. For the past winter had proved a crucial test to all Lisconnel's feeble folk, and few of them had struggled through it unscathed. Some of them, indeed, had come out on the wrong, or at any rate the other side. The Pat Ryans had lost their youngest twin child, which was still of a size to be called by the neighbours indifferently Joe and Molly, and which used to trot a long way after either of its parents when it saw them going anywhere. Old Mick Ryan, too, had died at the end of several days' lethargy, so deep that it was impenetrable by even the tobacco to purchase which his daughter, elderly Biddy, ran into debt, besides nearly walking herself off her legs in a forced march to the town and back. Under these circumstances Brian was in the humour to take quick alarm at his mother's weakness and flagging spirits, and now his impression that the dark figure standing in the ruined doorway had turned round and beckoned to him through the twilight put a finishing touch to his uneasiness. So much so that he resolved upon the extreme measure of seeking qualified medical advice, and to that end obtained a red ticket from Father Rooney, whereupon to Lisconnel came, Dr. Ward being on leave, a youthful locum tenens whose amiable qualities created a favourable impression. His report upon his patient was to the effect that he could see little amiss with her. "Sure it's active and robustus enough your mother seems to be for a body of her time of life." He was thus represented as expressing himself by Mrs. Brian. "But in course it stands to reason she isn't altogether as young as she was a while ago." Not having a turn for obvious pleasantries, he had given up adding in such cases she ought to have plenty of strengthening food. And "Goodness guide you, sir," says I to him, "sure she wasn't that afore ever you were born or thought of," says I, continued Mrs. Brian, who appeared somewhat illogically to consider this repartee a refutation of the doctor's cautiously worded statement. Her husband, on the other hand, felt by no means disposed to cavil at the verdict, which relieved his fears so happily that when he escorted the young man to his horse, he observed with strong emphasis, "It's real delightful weather we're gettin' now, your honour," although the bog was just then livid with low creeping flocks of pale mist, and the day had been as consistently dismal and lack-lustre a one as ever spent its drizzling hours in what we call neither raining nor letting it alone. The last Saturday in the following June was a shining contrast, a morning risen behind lattices of fretted snow sheen, which melted with ever widening interspaces, far up and away into faint lines and filmy streaks like the clouding on an agate, until, while the greensward underfoot was yet all beaded with prisms of dew, the lapis lazuli cup overhead curved down without a fleck from brim to brim. It was to be rather an eventful day for Lisconnel by reason of a fair held in the town, at which several of the neighbours proposed to sell their pigs and poultry. Lisconnel always sells its few pigs about this season, not because they are fat, but because the need of a little ready money becomes coercive in the month before potato digging. The place does not, I must admit, excel in swine, a fact hardly to be marvelled at when one considers how much plain living is perforce practised by the animals during their sojourn among us, even if it is accompanied by a corresponding high thinking, which must remain a matter of conjecture, that does not influence market prices. Seldom in the case of a Lisconnel pig will any amount of hopeful prodding and poking establish in its owner's mind a comfortable assurance of good condition, though a refractory beast, who has to be hauled shrieking out of a hole or lifted over a dyke, is conventionally described as the weight of any 10 begorra. Yet however humble our own opinion of our wares may be, it is trying to find the same confirmed for us sarcastically by other people. We do not like to be greeted after a long trudge by inquiries such as, "Wasn't it maybe a coursin' match you were intendin' to show them at all the while?" Or, "Might you ever ha' happened to take notice that in some places the pigs do have a fashion of wearin' their bones on the wrong side of their skins?" Or, "What at all do you be feedin' the bastes on up at Lisconnel? Old scythe blades belike? Or is it an odd taste of a slim-handled hay-rake?" These questions have before now been settled temporarily with the help of fists and blackthorns. The market folk set off betimes this morning, and as many of their neighbours were out on the bog cutting turf, the place grew very quiet. When once the squealing and squawking which attended their progress had died distantly away, it felt like a Sunday to the stayers at home, and it was partly this, and partly the glorious weather, that brought them together in a session on an undulating bank of fine sward, interspersed with boulders set flat in heathery rims, a favourite holiday lounging place not far from the Kilfoyles' cabin. Old Mrs. Kilfoyle was among them, brisker again in response to the call of June, but physically almost extinguished under the folds of her daughter-in-law's ample blue cloak, with which her winter's indisposition had been made a long-sought pretext for investing her, much against her will. Even Peter Sheridan made a shift to hobble out of doors, not leaving behind him his rheumatics, and bade scran to them, whose companionship is, however, least obtrusive when he can sit quiet in the warm clasp of the sun. Its beams came along and slanting still when the two last of the party bound for the fair were almost ready to start, the widow M'Gurk and Brian Kilfoyle. Brian was going as a buyer, not a seller, having disposed of his pig a week ago, when, finding that small pigs went cruel dear, he deferred the purchase of its successor in hopes to getting a better bargain later on. But the widow had on her hands both her pig and a clocking hen, with which, a clutch of eggs being unattainable, she had regretfully resolved to part. Brian had waited to assist her in the transportation of this live stock, but the hen, with a perverse prescience characteristic of her race, had at the last moment taken ungainly flight, and was now being pursued by himself and all the children out of arms. Meanwhile Mrs. M'Gurk, ready equipped for her journey, paused by the wayside group with her lean pig in a string. "We'd do right to leave that old rogue of a hen behind us," she said uneasily, while her beast fell to grazing industriously, as if bent upon adding at least a shilling to his market value. "She'll only be delayin' the man and spoilin' of his chances." "Och, they'll grab her prisintly, no fear. She can't keep that work up very long, try her best," said old Mrs. Kilfoyle, placidly listening to the receding sounds of the pursuit. "Sit you down, Mrs. M'Gurk, ma'am, and be taking the weight off your feet while you can. I hope you'll have good luck with that crathur there. He seems to be a tidy level little baste." "I wish I may do as well as Brian himself done last day wid his," said the widow. "'Twas a grand price entirely he got out of them, and if he can pick up a weeny one anyways raisonable, he'll be right enough, plase God." And we've a notion what else he'll be bringin' home wid him this evenin' over and above, haven't we now, Mrs. Ryan?" she added, glancing at Mrs. Kilfoyle, and winking with weather–beaten archness. "Troth have we," said Judy Ryan, "the same sort of notion I've got of what Mr. Corr does be weighin' out of a yeller papered box with black scrawms on it, and charges 8p. the quarther pound for, and blows open a purple bag to put it in. And then if your kettle's boilin' and your water's not smoked, 'twill be yourself's to blame if you haven't an iligant cup of tay." Judy was happily unconscious that the end of her enigma had escaped rather prematurely from its subtle unfoldures. "Aye, aye," said the little old woman, looking round her from friendly face to face in a pleased flutter, "Brian does be very good." And everybody smiled and winked and nodded approval, being fully in the secret of Brian's intentions. Everybody except Biddy Sheridan, who looked suddenly disconsolate, as if at a pang of jarred memory, where she sat peeling flakes of shaggy grey lichen off a sun–warmed stone. "Me brother Mick," she said in a semi–soliloquising murmur, "he very belike ha' been thinkin' of bringin' home a bit of baccy this night wid him too, if there was e'er a one left to set store by it. Mick never begrudged aught he could do for his old father, I'll say that for him. It wasn't in him, not when he had his own way." There was just a tinge of resentment in the last words. "And bedad now, Biddy," her sister-in-law's tone was undisguisedly deprecating, "bedad now, woman alive, nobody could lay it agin us that we either of us iver begrudged the poor old man, God be good to him, bit or sup, or any trifle of warmth or comfort we had the givin' of. I'm not goin' for deny that I might be a bit put past me patience, goodness forgive me, now and agin, when times was bad, to see his old pipe puffin'. 'Twas in a way like throwin' the childer's scrap of food behind the fire." "Accordin' to my considerin'," Mrs. Kilfoyle's falsetto flute piping interposed before Biddy could reply, "that baccy's a humbuggin' kind of ould stuff. Sure that's plain on the face of it, for except it was lettin' on to be somethin' different from itself, who'd give a brass farthin' for the likes of it? A little black lookin' lump you've as much botheration gettin' a smoulder of red out of it as if it was a wet sod of turf, and risin' such a smell. Faix, you might think they'd a cartload of pratie haulms burnin' in the pipe bowl. On'y I'd a dale liefer have that for a scent, och, but I remimber it in the fields at home. But the fact of the matter is, smokin's just a notion the crathurs have. When they get taken up wid it, 'tis the same to them as a peaceable sort of drunkenness, and puts the thought of the troubles they're in the middle of out of their heads. Many's the time I'd think of meself, Biddy, when I'd see your poor father sittin' inside there wid his feet in a puddle of rain, and the cold wind freezin' mad, and he lookin' fit to drop, and he contentin' himself all the while wid the ould pipe that was near shakin' out of his hand, the crathur. Many's the time I'd be thinkin' 'tis a poor case to have nothin' between yourself and all the divil's work about you better than a few streels of baccy smoke. Och, girl, we've no call to go wish any one back agin widin his reach, that's after givin' him the slip for good and all, and needn't be schamin' ways to disremimber himself and his tormentin' tricks." "That's the truth, ma'am," said Peter Sheridan hoarsely at her elbow. "I dunno, then," said Mrs. M'Gurk, who stood fronting the assembly, with her elongated shadow grotesquely deflected against the sunny bank, and who evidently entered her protest from the sense of duty, "I dunno how you're rightified in makin' sure you'll be shut of the devil as soon as you quit out of this, be any manner of means. Bedad, it may be quite the other way. My opinion of him is, you never can tell where he'll have you, dead or alive. For anything we know, he might be doin' as much agin us one place as the other, or maybe more, and bad luck to him." "Well, it's clear enough to me," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, "and the way I look at it is this. There's little misdoubtin' that the divil's plinty of since, however he came by it, and knows what he's about, God forgive him, as well as you or me. And he wouldn't be distressin' himself the way he is to keep annoyin' people if he didn't perceive that it was here he's gettin' his best chanst of doin' mischief on us, and nowhere else. He wouldn't give himself that much trouble, you may depind, if he thought he'd have us readier to his hand, merely be waitin' till the breath was out of one's body. Not he. He's too cute. For look at the carryin's on of him. Look at the contrivances he has, and the invintions. Sure there's nothin' big or little he wouldn't be for meddlin' in, though it might be a matter you'd never think he'd need to consarn himself wid, except he was fairly druv to it. Even so, he hasn't it all his own way. For whenever his betters have the time, now and again, to be keepin' an eye on him, he's bound to quit interferin', and iverything goes pleasant enough, and no thanks to him. Ay bedad, he gets a disappointment of an odd while, like any one else in this world. And mark my words, he wouldn't be spendin' so much of his days in it if there was e'er another place he could regulate more to his mind." "Unless 'twas for divarsion like," suggested Judy Ryan, "the same way that quality do come straightin' on the bog wid their guns, and wadin' up to their knees in the rivers after the bits of birds and fish, and they wid more than they can ate at home all the while, if it was that ailed them." "Divarsion? Why, woman dear, in course it's divarsion to him. What else should it be? But what I was sayin' is that it's here he has to come for it, same as quality after their shootin'. And when wunst we've took off wid ourselves, he's no more chanst agin us than they have at a flock of snipe they're after missin' and scarin'. And, signs on it, he's no ways wishful to be seein' folk he's plaguin' quit. If it's a young body now that's to be took, a bit of a child or a fine lad, who'll have plenty breakin' their hearts after them, that belike suits the ould nagur right well. He's nothin' to say agin it. They'll go fast enough. But there's a many misfort'nit crathur that unless the divil does his endeavours to keep them alive in their misery, I dunno who would." "True for you, ma'am," said Peter Sheridan again. "You might say so if you'd whiles feel the life was skivered into your body wid all the sharp ends of aches and pains, or else you'd be fit to stretch yourself out aisy, and away wid you." "Do not say such a thing then, father," said his daughter Peg, looking piteously at him, and all at once feeling like a parricide, as she bethought her how she had only last night assented to her stepmother's proposition that himself was gettin' uglier tempered wid every day went over his head. "But he's bound to let go a hould of you one time or another, Peter, please God," Mrs. Kilfoyle urged consolatorily. "Whatever villany he does on you, the end of it is he has to give it up at a bad job and leave you to go along and pace." "Arrah, now, will no talk content you but dyin' and the divil," remonstrated Mrs. Doyne. "To be hearin' you, one 'ud think we were just sittin' here a minute to wait till our coffins come up the road that the ould wan had the bespakin' of." She glanced furtively round the broad skyscape, and then huddled herself closer into the shelter of the hollow bank, tightening her skimpy shawl across her shoulders. "Sure I was manin' no harm wid it," said the old woman apologetically, "but we might aisy wisht about him for that matter. There's a good few things the divil has nothin' to say to, or dyin' either, though I dunno why people need mostly think so bad of that. It's maybe the sort of trouble there is shiftin' from one place to another that sets them agin it." "Aye," said Mrs. Quigley, "some botheration there's apt to be gettin' in and out of anything, if it's only elbowing your way out of chapel when there's a throng at Mass. and 'twill be right at the door you'll get the most crowdin' and pushin' and squeezin', fit to reive the ould rags off of your back. But just the next step beyond it, you're all the world clear before you, and room to be dancin' jigs in, if that was what you were after." "Crowdin', is it?" said Biddy Ryan. "Ah, jabbers, there's no crowdin' about it that I can see. Musha, it's part of the contrariness of the whole concern, that so long as you keep livin', there'll be people all about you galore, day out and day in, wid the childer bawlin' and screechin', and the lads quarrellin' and bangin' about, and everything all through other under your feet, till you're fairly moidhered, and thinkin' you'd be glad enough to find e'er a little hole away off be yourself for peace and quiet. But when you come to quittin' them all, and takin' off to nobody can rightly tell where, and you feelin' that quare and lost, you'd be ready to put up wid any company you could get, if it was on'y a brute baste. Och, then there's never a soul you'll have a chanst of along wid you, sorra a mortal one. Lonesome or no lonesome, it's be yourself you're bound to go." "That's the notion young people like you do have," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, who remembered Biddy's grizzled locks on a downy fluff. "But be the time you've lived as long as I, and seen as many comin' and goin' and stayin' away, you'll find it's behind you that you're lavin' the most of the lonesomeness. Seems to me 'twould ha' saved a power of work if Almighty God would ha' been content to make the one job of it, and stick us all down wherever it was we were meant to stop, widout any shiftin' us back and forwards," said Annie Sheridan, who had come up with a large turf creel on his shoulders, and crouching under it on the top of the bank had somewhat the aspect of a straity lodged hermit crab. "It's the same as if you were to be plantin' your pitaties in half a dozen different places before you'd made your mind up to the right one, and that's a quare way of doin' business." "Perhaps you've no call to be in a hurry, me tight lad, to find yourself settled in a place you're bound for," quoth Mrs. M'Gurk grimly, for Andy was not in her good graces. "Maybe not," he said, undoubling himself to aim a conjectural cuff at his half sister Rose, whom he heard trying to tilt over his creel from behind. "But whether or no, where's the sinse of it?" "Well, sure, for one thing, if people were to ha' been always in the good place, they mightn't ever know the differ," said Judy Ryan, coming in first, while her neighbours was still casting about for hypotheses. "And supposin'," said Andy, swinging his legs unimpressed, "where'd be the harm of not knowin' the differ, when there was nary a differ to know?" Judy was not prepared to elucidate this point, and looked her perplexity. "Who said there was any sinse in it?" demanded Peter Sheridan glumly. "As like as not there's none." He was staring straight before him, seemingly in at the black doorway, not many paces distant, out of which he had painfully crawled. "Ah, now, I declare I daresay that's it, glory be to goodness," said Judy, brightening up as if piously relieved at this solution of the difficulty. "Very belike there's no sinse in it at all. It's just the will of God." "And we needn't be concernin' ourselves about that anyhow," said Mrs. Quigley. "Eh, lads dear, we'll all git sorted right enough one way or the other," Mrs. Kilfoyle said, summing up rather hurriedly, for it struck her that the discussion was developing a note of acrimony. "We're better off at all evints than if we were to be beginnin' wid the good and endin' wid the bad. And here's Brian after catchin' the ould hin." "Bad manners to her then be givin' him such a dance," said Mrs. M'Gurk. Brian had his captive in a dishevelled wicker basket, from beneath the wobbling lid of which she frequently thrust her witless black head to squawk, at an imminent risk of guillotining, since he suppressed her demonstrations as promptly as if they had been applause in a court of justice. "Begorra, ma'am," he said, "if there was anybody down beyant offerin' a stiff price for a sort of ould screech owl wid springs in the legs of her like a grasshopper's, when she's tired flyin' up over your head like an eagle, you've a right to make your fortune this day. It's lucky I thought to give Norah the hankycher wid the bit of money in it afore she went on, for afraid it might get joggled out of me somehow shankin' down. But it's steppin' we ought to be. Good bye to you kindly, mother, and keep us a sup of hot water boilin'." The widow twitched away her pig from his grazing, which caused him to exchange his appreciative "hurrumps" for Protestant squeals, and they were all three soon out of sight behind the ridge of the knockawn. "They'll be no great while overtaking the others at that gait of goin'," said Biddy Ryan. "Och, but 'tis a long draggin' stretch of road, weary on it, and lenthens itself out ivery time you go it. But there's none of us will have tramped it as often as yourself, Mrs. Kilfoyle, ma'am." "Belike no, me dear," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, "considerin' all the years' start I've had of the whole of yous. Sure I was no age at all, you may say, when first we travelled it. This end of it wasn't rightly finished. Faith, Lisconnel was but a poor lookin' place in those days, and for a while after we did be livin' here, we always called it the road home, because 'twas along it we came out of the ould place in the County Clare. Then if we wanted to keep the childer pacified, that was mostly small rampagin' spalpeens, we'd only to let on we were settin' out back again, and they'd trot along till they were tired. But the day me father was buried down beyant, nothin' we could do or say 'ud persuade the crathurs that he hadn't just gone home to fetch our couple of cows. 'Deed, poor man, he fretted terrible about the little black Kerry he left behind. Rosine Dhu, he called her, and they did be lookin' out a great while expectin' him to come drivin' her along. Do you see the white stone, Biddy, up there agin the edge of the headland? That's where little Thady, me youngest brother, 'ud sit watchin' many a day, and had me poor mother distracted more be token, wid runnin' tumblin' in to see her like a bit of a puppy, yellin' that his father was comin' up the road. It's a quare imp of a child, Thady was, that went to the mackerel fishin', and was drowned in Galway Bay." "I just can mind hearin' talk of Thady Joyce," said Peter Sheridan, "but troth, you'll git ahead backwards of the whole of us, ma'am, when it's a matter of recollections." "Yit for as long as I'm in Lisconnel," Mrs. Kilfoyle said meditatively, "I scarce think I've ever got the idea of it all clear in me head, the same way I have the ould place at home. It doesn't seem that natural to me somehow. Leastways these times when I don't be traipsin' about much, the lie of the land gits moidhered up in me mind as if 'twas wid a mist risin'. But Clonmena now, sure to this day if I'm lyin' awake in the night, I can be goin' over the whole of it, lighted up in me thoughts, same as I used to, and I a slip of a lass sleepin' in the bit of a room away under the thatch, lookin' out above the front door, wid the river runnin' by. Sure I knew every inch of ground it flowed over, and whilst afore I fall asleep I divert myself threadin' the fields and all along it, as if you were slippin' your beads through your fingers. First it's in our couple of fields that's the one of them narther and long shaped, and the other of them scooped out hollow and round like a sort of nest, and the both of them as smooth and as green as the moss shining in the cracks of this old stone. And then across the end of young Conroy's meadow below the high bank and the hawthorns atop, and after that off wid it under the dark bridge on the Borisk road, and spreadin' out on the grey gravel beds and among the clumps of cress. 'Tis but a poor hungry bit of land, all tussocks and ragweed, till it runs round the hill foot among the firs, and gets slitherin' away down and down past the smothered stones and the brown roots, and the fern leaves drippin', and the stems tumblin' aslant making for the bottom of the deep glen. And in there it does be shut close, wid the trees roofing it overhead, and the little path waving up and down alongside it all the way to the old mill at Kildrum. So a bit beyond it takes out into the river Coolanaw, no less. That's a powerful width of water. Saints alive, sure I could be following it along blindfold. Or if it was the wind I heard comin' rustlin' by the other way, I could tell where it was goin' wid itself, keenin' up the boreen behind the house and out on the big, steep pitaty field, and beyond that agin, over the grass slopes and the sheep browsin' and the breadth of bracken and furze bushes, till the great cliffs go down at your feet slap into the sea like the wall of a church tower. When you look over the edge you might think there was the white wing of a gull just fluttering at the bottom, but musha, all the while it's the foam of a big wave rolled in fit to lift you off your 2 feet, supposin' you were anywheres it could get a grab at you. You'll hear the sound of them comin' up ivery once in a while, like as if 'twas the river stoppin' to take breath. But it's the flow of the river I do be missin' most out of it, these times when I'm remimberin' it to meself. I've a notion I'd get a great weep entirely if ever I come widin sound of it agin, for 'twas the last thing I'd mind afore I dropped off, and as like as not the first thing I'd hear in the mornin' would be our creatures of ducks flusterin' into it one after the other off of the flat steppin' stone, and I'd up wid me and out to see to gettin' in the eggs. Goodness guide me, 'twas only the other day, wakin' up, I thought I heard me poor mother callin' "Chooky, chooky" to her hens as natural as could be, and it just Mrs. Pat huntin' home her little goat. I dunno what 'ud romancin' I have," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, interrupting herself, "but this while back I've nothin' on'y them far gone days runnin' in me mind. Seems like as if there must be somethin' rael quare ahead of me that hinders me thinkin' forwards." End of section 7. Section 8 of Irish Idylls by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 8. "God save you, woman dear, what quareness should there be in it at all?" said Judy Ryan, looking vaguely disquieted. "Why, sure you were always great at remimberin'. Often enough you've told us the same things afore now, and it's but natural. Just as if a body climbin' a wall 'ud be facin' about to look the way he'd come up, for the sake of a rest." "And there's scarce a one, old or young," said Biddy Ryan, "but has the feelin' they'd be ready for a good sleep at the day's end, river or no river. Sorra the queerness there's in that. The strongest great big bosthoon of a man that ever stepped," she averred, looking argumentatively at the little old woman, "would be thinkin' of gettin' to sleep when he's tired. There's nothin' like it. Not but what to be sittin' aisy in the sun when you get the chanst this a way is mighty agreeable. Isn't it now, ma'am? Look at the light dancin' away yonder in the pool. You might say the water's thinkin' to churn itself into gould and silver." "Aye, aye, Biddy," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, not looking as far as the bright pool, "'tis all like a kind of pictur to me. But the warmth of the sun does me heart good, and the simmerin' summerin' there is through it, same as if we had the old kettle sittin' on the hob." The noontide was indeed going by to an accompaniment of elfin clicking and creaking and whirring, kept up unintermittently on the glowing sward with its tenant grasshoppers and beetles and blue and red winged flies, and overborne by a droning boom as often as the dusty bee backed out of one freckled foxglove's purple shaded cell and went murmuring to toil and swing in another. Butterflies cruised idly nowhere in particular on white sails, or streaked with orange and scarlet, and mailed dragonflies poised and darted in vivid jewelled gleams. There was scarcely breeze enough stirring to whisk the fuzzy white wigs off the seeded dandelions, and up on the ridge of hill a hot air quivered against the rocks like a curtain about to rise. Lisconnel with its bog lay basking very wide and still, making the most of such a midsummer sun as seldom looks down upon us. Nothing happened to disturb its quiet perceptibly all the long morning. The neighbours had their dinner when the shadows were shortest, which was the most clearly defined hour of the day for them, now that the widow M'Gurk's old clock had given up even pretending to keep time. And when the turf cutters began again to pass leisurely to and fro, halting with their creels at the bank where the same group had reassembled. So when, well on in the afternoon, Brian Kilfoyle tramped over the hill into Lisconnel, he found everything there very much as he had left it. A grievous change had, however, come over his own frame of mind. He was in a sort of white heat, both physically and mentally, what with his long walk in the eye of the sun and his wrath and consternation. His look showed plainly that some untoward event had brought about his return surprisingly early, for no one had been expected to reappear in such very broad daylight. "She's lost it on us," he said, confronting his neighbours' interrogative faces with an ironical calm. "The price of the pig, every penny of it, that's all." "Och, man alive, don't say so," said his mother. "Saints and patience, how ever would she happen to go do such a thing?" said Judy Ryan. "You lie," said Mrs. Quigley, intending to politely convey sympathy mingled with amazement. "It's truth I'm tellin' yous," Brian said bitterly. "Sure, when we were about comin' on be the luck, sure, and the walk of the world we had, gittin' that far wid the ould divil skins of a hin, that kep' her eye cocked to be flyin' out on us every step we went. 3 several times she got away wid herself, and had Mrs. M'Gurk almost kilt skirmishin' after her, meself bein' took up controllin' the pig. Sure there the first thing I beheld was Norah and Nelly stoopin' down lookin' for we couldn't think what along the middle of the road. So says I to her when we come up, 'Is it mushrooms yous are gatherin' there, woman?' says I, 'or maybe you'd politefully tell us whether you're weedin' a pitaty bed or walkin' to the town.' And wid that she up and began givin' me all sorts for not tyin' the corner of me ould handkerchief right, so as the money wouldn't ha' been slippin' out and goin' to loss along the road. For she'd carried it in her hand the whole way along, never let go of it for an instinct. And when she thought to be lookin' to see was it all right, and she comin' into the town, me sowl to the saints if the knot hadn't slipped, and never a bawbee was there left in the blamed ould rag. As regardin' the tyin' now, I ha' been ready to take me oath anywhere, and so I told her I done it safe enough, but there, have it as you will, we've made a good job of it between the two of us, every farthin' gone." Here everybody pointed out, with slight verbal variations, that if 'twas along the road she'd lost it, he might have a great good chanst of gettin' it yet. Any person might be findin' it passin' by. "Sure I'm just after goin' over every step of it," he responded hopelessly, "and ne'er a trace any more than if they'd been meltin' hailstones. There was the 10 shilling bit, there's no size at all, it would roll away into nowhere. I'd never look to be seein' sight or light of it again. But I was thinkin' I might be good luck had hit on some of the silver and coppers. Divil a one. Howsomever, if I'd picked up so much as a couple of shillin's, mother jewel, I had got you your trifle of tay and sugar, begorra would I, whatever else might be takin' or lavin'. for I think real bad of you bein' disappointed of it." "Lord love you, Brian Vic, niver go for to be troublin' your mind about any such a thing," piped Mrs. Kilfoyle. She had been in truth looking forward incredibly to the fragrant cups of hot tea with which it was an open secret that her son purposed to provide her upon acquiring capital. "I dunno that I've ever a fancy these times to be drinkin' tea at all. Ah, dear, it's a terrible heavy loss on you, so it is, the both of yous, but plase God you might git it agin. And anyways, man dear, there's the goat you'd 20 different minds about sellin'. She and a pair of the young hens 'ud mostly fetch you the price of a wee pig, so as you wouldn't be at the loss of a one for fattenin', wid all the waste pitaties comin' in. Sure you're dead beat, child alive, wid trampin' it in the sun's blazes. Sit down aisy and be restin' yourself, or maybe you get a bit to eat first in the house." "But it's steppin' back I must be directly," said Brian, "and I have a couple of cold pitaties in me pocket here if I was wantin' anythin'. If I don't fetch home Norah, she and Nelly 'll be searchin' the road till this time to morra." "Ah, the crathur," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, "she's frettin' herself, you may depind. If you do a bad turn, be ever such an accident, you're the feelin' 'twas your own fault all the while, and it's cruel discouragin', for by bein' apart to start, you argufyin' and contendin'." Brian presently set out again through the rich afternoon light with his fallen fortunes. He felt but slightly consoled by his mother's suggestions, and dawdled on slowly, having no sense of a definite object to make him step out. After a while he sat down and ate his cold potatoes, in which likewise he found but little solace. Then, as, drawing near Classon's Boreen, he was about to turn off the road and take a short cut across a soft bit of bog, just passable in dry weather, he became aware of somebody signalling to him on ahead. If the hour had been later, this might have seemed an alarming incident, but in the clear rays, where we scarcely believe much more than we can see, he at once discerned that it was merely Big Anne, clumping along heavily footed with her market basket. "I wonder to goodness gracious why the old woman can't set the flat of her feet to the ground like a Christian," he said to himself, while he went towards her, surveying her ungraceful progress with a censorious eye, his mood being attuned to miscellaneously adverse criticism, instead of stompin' that fashion, as if 'twas her notion to drive home a 2-inch nail wid each step she took. "Have you got it yet, Brian, man?" she inquired as they met. Brian shook his head. "Nor never will," he said supplementarily. "Oh well, you won't be so," Big Anne said with confidence. "It's bound to be somewheres. 'Tisn't as if 'twas a pound note that might blow away on you. And here's your bit of tay and sugar," she continued, groping among the contents of her basket. "I thought if that was what you were goin' after, I'd save you a tramp." "Tay?" repeated Brian distractedly. "Tea? Sure, woman, what talkin' have you of tea, and I wid never the price of a hap'orth left me in creation. 'Twould be just borrying alone, like, till you can put your hand on your money agin, and the mischief take the inconvenience 'twill be to me whativer. Troth, I don't rightly know what I wanted wid gettin' it at all, for Mad Bell she won't touch e'er a drop of it, and it's poor work tay drinkin' when you have it all to yourself. Only me ould pig went better than common, and I got hould of a little fellow Pat Ryan's bringin' along for me surprisin' cheap. So it seemed nathural like to get a pound of tea. But then when Mrs. Brian told me how she was after meetin' the misfortin to mislay all the bit of money, thinks I to meself it might maybe come in handy for you, supposin' you weren't wishful to disappoint your poor mother of it this evening, and she belike wid her mind set on havin' a sup. Sure Mrs. Brian was tellin' me she noticed her this mornin' early dustin' herself a couple of the cups and saucers, when she thought no one was mindin', to have them ready. Fit to cry your wife was too, poor woman, wid the notion she'd be vexed gettin' none. Though persuade her so I put me best fut forward, for afraid I'd miss you comin' back. Faith, there's a power of heat yet in that sun. 'Twould be just robbin' you downright, neither more nor less, if we'd take it off of you," said Brian, wistfully eyeing the dark purple parcels which Big Anne had by this time fished out of her basket. "Thank you kindly all the same, but I couldn't put it on me conscience to." A yell, suddenly let fast by interrupted them, and hurtling towards them over a wet tract of glistening pools came with kangaroo-like bounds, which terminated indifferently in land or water, a Rafferty gossoon. "Count it," he panted, thrusting something into Brian's hand. "We make it 17 and fourpence, and old Mrs. Kilfoyle says that's right. Whew, butterfingers, you've dropped 2 pennies. Faix, I needn't ha' run the feet off me legs if you only wanted it to sling about the road." "And where in the name of everything else did you get it at all?" said Brian, staring bewilderingly at his recovered wealth. "Lyin' in our window at home it was. Nannie's after findin' it just now, comin' in off the bog. They was sayin' you'd likely laid it down out of your hand somehow, afore you started settin' out this mornin'. Be the piper, sure enough I was up there splicin' the handle of your mother's old basket, and it's just then I must ha' overlooked it. Och, murdher, and me standin' it out to poor Norah that I'd tied it up most particular in the handkercher corner, so as it hadn't a chanst to be slippin' out be any manner of means, I said. So as it hadn't a chance to be slippin' out be any manner of means, I said. And that part of it was true enough. Bedad, she'll be for killin' me alive when she hears tell. But whether or no, I'm a proud man to have it back. I must be trottin' on to let her know it's got, for cryin' her eyes out, dispirit the crathur, was the last sight I saw of her. So you perceive I've no call to be troublin' you now about the tea, ma'am, but I'm highly obligated to you all's one." "And what hour of the day or night might you be expectin' to get home then?" said Big Anne, still holding her rejected packets with a mortified air, "for it's not far from sunsettin' this instant minute. And be the time you've got down to the town and bought your tea and all, and legged it back again wid Norah and little Nelly, that can't overhurry themselves, 'twill be fine and late. Bedad, it's not much tea your mother'll get the drinkin' of this night, if she's to wait for that. She's apt to be in her 7th sleep afore you come." Brian stood perplexed by conflicting wishes. He wanted to hasten on and relieve his wife's mind, and he wanted his mother to get her tea, and he wanted to have the pleasure of personally presenting it to her. However, the result of his deliberations was that he said, "Well then, if it wouldn't be to inconvenience you, ma'am, I'll ax you to leave it up at our house. She'll know all about it, and that would be what I'm owin' you, ma'am." He counted out the shillings and pennies upon the lid of her basket, and she swept them into it half reluctantly. "But I'm sure I'm much beholden to you, for if it wasn't only for you, me mother 'ad been disappointed of her bit of enjoyment this night anyway." He set off dog-trotting, and Big Anne said to the lad, "Bill, you spalpeen, you'll skyte home a dale quicker than I'll be stumpin' it. Take the bit of tea and sugar along wid you, and leave it at Mrs. Kilfoyle's. Just slip it unbeknownst on to the table, if nobody's in the house, and then when she comes in she'll be findin' it." And as she toiled stiffly along the far-stretching road, a flourish of legs and arms dwindling in front showed her that Bill was speeding on his errand. But Lisconnel, meanwhile, that golden afternoon quietude seemed to close over the perturbing incidents of the loss and recovery of the Kilfoyles' shillings as serenely as the still waters of a sun-shimmering lake close again over a fish's leap. The last ripple of excitement had so died away that the elders were at leisure to notice some slight symptoms of trouble which arose among an adjacent cluster of small children soon after Bill Rafferty had started in pursuit of Brian. They had been playing peaceably together for a long time in a grassy recess, young Kilfoyles and Quigleys and Ryans, but now some sounds of whimpering distress betokened a marring of harmony. "Arrah now, what's ailin' yous childer?" inquired Judy Ryan, leaning forward to overlook them from the vantage of a rather higher perch. Whereupon Jim Kilfoyle's whimpering developed into a pronounced howl, while several of his companions replied shrilly, "Jim's after killin' a green beetle. He trod on it runnin' about and kilt it dead." "And what made him go for to do that?" said Judy reprovingly. "Sure they're dacint grey lookin' little things. If it had been any of them black bastes of Dowduff's, now they'd ha' been a raison in it. I'd put me fut on one of them meself fast enough, on'y 'twould make me flesh creep to go near it. I thought I was spyin' a sight of one stickin' his hidjis head out between them two stones a while ago. Och!" Judy gathered her skirts about her shudderingly at the recollection. "I believe they're but innocent poor cratures all the while, if they have an ugly appearance on them," said Mrs. Quigley. "If they were twyste as innocent," Judy persisted, "I wouldn't touch one wid a 40-foot pole. And more betoken, I dunno where else they'd ha' got such a way of cockin' up their tails at you, unless they were a sort of divil." "I didn't go for to do it," Jim said, emerging temporarily from his remorse to vindicate his character. "It ran in right under me feet on purpose when I was watchin' for it twinklin' in the grass, and I didn't know where it would be comin' to." "He was the greenest beetle I ever saw," said Rose Ryan, peering at the glitter of emerald, shot with bronze and gold, which Katty Sheridan held ruefully in her palm. "Rael purty and shiny he was, that colour'd look lovely in a string of beads." "And see now what come to him wid it, Rose," said her mother hortatively. Rising feminine vanity need never suppose that repressive morals will not be drawn for its behoof because it lives remotely in the far west and goes on bare feet in rags. Very belike he was that sot up wid thinkin' he was so green and shiny he didn't mind where he was goin', and there's how he got kilt. If he hadn't been runnin' about as if the whole place was belongin' to him, it might never have happened him at all." "Maybe if Danny O'Beirne was at home," speculated Joe Quigley, "he could ha' set it goin' agin, same way as he mended up the inside of Widdy M'Gurk's ould clock. It wouldn't stir and nothin' lookin' to be ailin' it, till he gave it an odd poke or two to the wheels, and then it went on grand, and there's no great signs of anythin' broke in the beetle." "Och, but there's no life left in him whativer," pronounced Joe's brother, who had been warily experimenting with a daisy stalk, "or else he'd be wigglin' his legs like mad every time you tickle them." "His legs do be very black lookin', mind you," said Katty, who seemed to consider that this physical trait materially diminished the pathos of the situation. She dropped the creature down on the grass, and the regrets roused by its tragical fate subsided rapidly into oblivion. Only Jim, the perpetrator of the deed, sat still brooding over it beside the body of the slain, a prey to the limitless remorse of 5-year-olds. As the other children moved away from the place, he remained squatting in his dejected attitude so long that his grandmother was struck by it and said, "What ails Jim, I wonder, not to run about wid the others? He's apt to be gittin' sleepy." "He's liker to be frettin' yet about desthroyin' of the beetle," said Biddy Ryan. "Jim's unnatural took up wid bastes of the kind. His mother was tellin' me the other day he come into her somewhiles wid his hands full of ladybirds and moths and such, and never one of them hurted. So he's apt to think bad of killin' anythin'." "Jim," said old Mrs. Kilfoyle, "I'm goin' in to mind the fire, and when I come out, will I bring you the ould salt bottle to play wid a bit?" Jim's state of depression permitted him to nod only a joyless and disconsolate assent. Yet the loan of this article was generally a favour much in request. A relic of the mythical good old days, and the handiwork of Mrs. Kilfoyle's mother, it was a smallish glass bottle, to whose inner sides were mysteriously applied shreds of bright coloured fabrics, mostly bits of the apple green chintz which had made her own wedding gown. The bottle had then been tightly stuffed with salt, which threw out the brilliant hues on a pleasingly white and opaque background, and though now somewhat stained and discoloured by the damps of so many years, it still remained a precious heirloom in the Kilfoyle family, whose resources no longer commanded the production of decorative art. "Well, I'll bring it along wid me, honey," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, getting up and standing beside the child, "and if I was you, I'd just cover the poor beetle up comfortable under a scrapeen of moss or somethin' and let it be. I'd liefer he'd lave off bein' kilt and get skytin' about the same way he was before," said Jim reluctantly, accommodating himself to circumstances, and beginning to grub up a tiny velvet sod. "He does be that shinin' in the sun." "Maybe it might yet," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, "if 'twas left in peace and not interfered wid. It might ha' come to itself, and you might be watchin' it runnin' about agin be next summer time. Sure, maybe 'tis no lie I'm tellin' him all the while," the little old woman soliloquised, as she went towards her shadowy doorway with its haze of clear blue smoke, "for it's nary a know I know what's gone wid the spark of plisure did be in the crathur." That night, not long before the rising of the moon, a great wing of feathery white, which had spread all athwart the sky at sunset, swept away to the east, and the stars, till then visible only glimmer by glimmer, blinking far up behind the drifting plumes, were seen to have mustered in one of their vastest assemblies. The numberless brilliance of their array attracted the notice of two wayfarers, who were walking along the bog road towards Lisconnel, so closely muffled by the rustling darkness round about that to the external world they seemed merely voices and footsteps. "They've a great ould crop of stars up there this night," said one voice, "and twinklin' fit to thrimble themselves out of their holes." "Aye," said the other, "I wish I'd as many shillin's in me pocket." "Talkin' of shillin's, I wonder did Brian Kilfoyle ever get the hantle of his money he was after losin' on the road?" "Och, yes he did, poor man, and a good job too. He's got trouble enough on him this minute widout any more misfortins." "Why, is there anything gone agin the Kilfoyles lately?" "Sure, didn't you hear tell? The ould mother's just died on him." "No, bedad, is it ould Mrs. Kilfoyle? Och, wirrasthrew, the poor old woman. And what took her at all?" "Faix, I can't tell you. She'd just stepped indoors this evenin' to put her pot on the fire, and some of them comin' in a while afterwards, it's dead they found her there. Sure she was a wonderful great age entirely this long while back. The life was ready to flutter away out of her like the bit of down sittin' on a thistle in a waft of wind. Eh, but Brian, poor man, he'll be woful put about. He was always thinkin' a heap of the ould mother. Sure, when I met him down below only this mornin', he was in the terriblest takin' at all, because he couldn't be bringin' her some little treat he'd promised her, be raison of losin' his bit of money. If he'd known but all, he needn't ha' been frettin' himself about that. But she got it, be good luck she got it afore she went. And belike 'twill be a sort of satisfaction to Brian, and a consolement to his mind, that he done her the last thing he had the chanst to. for the time they found her, there she was sittin' with her old teapot on her lap that she'd reached off the shelf, and she'd the pound parcel of tay opened, as if she was intindin' to wet herself a drop. Och, now the crathur to think of that. Whisht, me sowl, whisht, man, what was that we heard?" "What was it? Nothin' but a plover pipin' over be the lough. 'Tis a powerful dark night, considerin' the sight of stars that are out on it. Howsomever, the moon'll be risin' afore you're home, bedad. There she is about gittin' up wid herself yonder, where the light strakes down, like as if you'd been scrapin' a match against a wall. So she is. Prisintly she'll be swimmin' up meltin' herself in the light like a bit of ice in clear water, same as she was last night, and then I'll pick me way back finely. Poor Mrs. Kilfoyle, heaven shine on her soul in glory. The dacint poor old body she was, and always wid a good word for every one. They'll be real annoyed to hear tell of it at our place, and you'll be missin' her many a day up at Lisconnel. It's a great opinion yous all had of her entirely. Faith, and we had then, little and big. But anyway, she's got the best of it over us. We'll do well enough if so be we've the luck to slip off as easy when we come to quittin'. Aye, will we, please God." Chapter 10. Coming and Going. The summer following Mrs. Kilfoyle's death was, what with one thing and another, a drearyish season at Lisconnel. That little old woman had left a great gap, and there came many long spells of gloomy bad weather, which seemed to beat people's troubles down upon them, as the damp drove the turf reek back through their smoke holes into the dark rooms, where they could not see how dense the blue haze was growing. Stacey Doyne's marriage also had removed something young and pleasant, and at times, when the thatch dripped without and within, neighbours were apt to talk about her in tones of commiseration, and say, "Sure her poor mother's lost entirely." So that towards autumn the distraction of some new resident's arrival happened rather opportunely. It was made possible by the fact that Big Anne had given up her holding and entered into partnership with Widow M'Gurk, thus leaving her late abode empty for another tenant, who appeared much sooner than any one might have anticipated from the aspect of the cabin. Except as a fresh topic of conversation, however, the strangers gave small promise of proving an acquisition to the community. Lisconnel did not like their appearance by any means, and further acquaintance failed to modify unfavourable first impressions. These were mainly received in the course of the day after their arrival, which took place on a night too black for anything beyond a shadowy counting of heads, and a perception that the bulk of the newcomers' household stuff had jogged up on one donkey, and must therefore be small. A portion of Big Anne's furniture had remained behind her in the cabin, owing to certain arrears of rent. Her heart was scalded, she said, wid the prices she'd only get for her early chuckens, and they the weight of the world if you'd feel them in your hand. And poor Mad Bell, that'd mostly bring home a few odd shillin's wid her, was away since afore Christmas, and might never show her face there again, the creature, a bit of narration which would look funny enough in anybody's rental. Mrs. Quigley, who went to the door with an offer of a firelight, found it shut, and a voice inside said, "As unmannerly as you please." "No, we've matches," whereupon another voice further in the interior quavered, "Thank'ee kindly." So she departed, little wiser than she had come. But daylight showed that the party consisted of an old man and his son, and his son's wife, and her sister, and 3 small children, besides some cochin china fowl and a black cat with vividly green eyes. This much was apparent on the surface. Also that the old man was frail, bent, shrivelled, and civil spoken, that the son was a big soft gomeril of a fellow, that both the women were sandily flaxen haired, with broad flat cheeks and light eyes, that two of the children resembled them in an infantine way, and that the third, a girl a trifle older, was a dark-haired, disconsolate-looking little thing, with her face, Mrs. Brian said, not the width of a halfpenny herring, and the eyes of her sunk in her head. As for the fowl, there could be no doubt that their unnatural long flufferty legs were fit to make a body's flesh creep, and the cat looked as like an old devil as anything you ever witnessed, sittin' blinkin' atop of the turf stack. Other less self-evident facts came out by degrees, slower than might have been expected, as the strangers were generally close and chary of speech. They came from the north, where their affairs had not prospered. In fact, they had been sold up and put out of it, as the young man divulged one day to Brian Kilfoyle. They were a somewhat intricately connected family by the name, predominantly of Patman. The sister-in-law was Tishy M'Crum, which seemed simple enough, but the two light-haired boys were Greens, Mrs. Patman having been a widow, while the little girl was the child of a wife whom Tom Patman had already buried, for though he looked full young to have embarked upon matrimony at all, this was his second venture. "And it's a quare comether she must ha' been after puttin' on him," quoth Mrs. Quigley, "afore he took up wid herself. That's as ugly as if she was bespoke, and half a dozen year older than the young bosthoon if she's a minute." It is true that at the time when Mrs. Quigley expressed this unflattering opinion, she and her neighbours had been exasperated by an impolite speech of Mrs. Patman, who had said loudly in their hearing, "Well, for certain, if I'd had a notion of the blamed little dog hole he was bringin' us into, sorra the sole of a foot I'd ha' set inside it," and had been proceeded to congratulate herself upon having left all her decent bits of furniture up above at her mother's, so that she needn't be bothered with cartin' them away out of a place that didn't look to have had e'er a thing in it worth the trouble of movin', not if it stood there until it dropped to pieces with dirt. Mrs. Quigley rejoined that it would be a great pity if any people stayed in a place that wasn't good enough for them, supposing all the while they knew of ever a better one. Maybe they might, and maybe they mightn't. It was wonderful to hear the talk some folks had wid every ould stick they owned, an easy loadin' for Riley's little ass. But Judy Ryan, with a flight of sarcastic fancy, hoped that Mrs. Patman and her family were about going on a visit to the Lady Lieutenant, because it was much as if they'd find any place else where they'd be grandeur accordin' to their high-up notions. Skirmishes such as this, however, were a symptom rather than a cause of the Patmans' unpopularity. That sprang from several roots. For one thing, both the women had harsh, scolding voices, and it was even chances that if you passed within earshot of their cabin you would hear them giving tongue. Their objurgations were as a rule addressed to the young man or the old, the latter of whom presently grew into an object of local compassion, as a harmless, dacent, poor creature, while his son came in for the frank-eyed looking down upon which is the portion of an able-bodied man shrew-ridden through sheer supineness and polthroonery. But what Lisconnel often said that it thought badder of was the stepmotherly treatment which seemed to be the lot of the little girl Katty. Of course the situation was one which under the circumstances would have made people believe in such a state of things upon the slenderest evidence. Still, even to unprejudiced eyes it was clear that Katty's rags were raggeder than those of her small step-brothers, and that she crept about with the mien of a creature which was conceived reasonable doubts respecting the reception it is likely to meet in society. when the autumn weather began to grow wintry, little Katty Patman, perishin' about out there in the freezin' wind, became a spectacle which was viewed with indignant sympathy from dark doorways whence she received many an invitation to step in and be warmin' herself. Her hostesses opined that she was fairly starved just for a taste of the fire, and didn't believe she was ever let next to or nigh it in her own place. Often, too, the consideration that she had no more flesh on her bones than a March chicken led to the bestowal of a steaming potato or a piece of griddle bread, but the result of this was sometimes unsatisfactory to the giver, Katty being apt to dart away with her refreshments, which she might presently be seen sharing among Bobby and Hughey, for whom she entertained a strong and apparently unreciprocated regard. "I wouldn't go for to be sayin' anythin' to set her agin them," Mrs. Brian remarked on some such occasion, "but goodness forgive me, I've no likin' for them two little brats. I mistrust them." "Ah, sure they've no sense," said Biddy Ryan. "Where would they get it? And the biggest of them I'd suppose under 4 years old." "Sinse," said Mrs. Quigley. "Bedad then, if sinse was all that ailed them, the pair of them is as cute as a couple of foxes. I mind a day or so after they'd been in it, I met the last one in the road, and I comin' wid be chance a sugar stick in me basket. So just to be makin' friends like, I gave it a bit for itself, and a bit for the other that I seen comin' along. Well now, ma'am, if it had took and eat up the both bits, I'd ha' thought ne'er a pin's point of harm. 'Twould ha' been natural enough to the size of it. But I give you me word, when it seen it couldn't get the two of them swallered down afore his brother come by, what did it go do but clap the one of them into a crevice in the wall, and cover it over under a blackberry leaf, and wid that down it squats and begins sayin', 'Creely crawly snail, where's the creely crawly snail I'm after huntin' out of its hole?' lettin' on to be lookin' for somethin' creepin' in the grass, and a while after it came slinkin' back, when it thought nobody was mindin', to poke the bit out of the wall where I was gatherin' dandelions under the bank. So while I was fumblin' about missin' the right crivice, sez I, poppin' up thinkin' to shame it, 'Maybe the crawly snail after eatin' it on you,' sez I. 'Och yis, I seen it,' sez the spalpeen, as brazen as brass. 'Gimme another bit instead. There's a schemin' young rapscallion for you.'" "They're too like their mother altogether," said Judy Ryan. "The corners of their eyes do be as sharp as if they were cut out wid a pair of scissors. Not that I'd mind if they'd e'er a sthrake of good nature in them, but I misdoubt they have. The little girl now is as diff'rint as day and night. If she takes after a father, she's a right to want the wit powerful misfort'nit little imp," said Mrs. Brian. "For if he isn't a great stupid gomeral and an ass, just get me one. Why, if he was worth pickin' out of a dry ditch, he'd prevent of his own child bein' put upon." "Och, they have him frighted," said Mrs. Quigley, with a scornful emphasis. "They won't let him take an atom of notice of her, they're that jealousy. Sure he gets talkin' to her outside the house there, one of them'll let a bawl and send him off to be carryin' in turf and water. I've seen it time and again. If he'd take and sling it about their ears some fine day, he'd be doin' right, and it might larn 'em to behave themselves," said Judy. "But the ould man would disgust you," said Mrs. Quigley, "wid the romancin' he has out of him about his son Tom. You'd suppose, to listen to him, that the omadhawn's equal never stepped. He'll deive you wid it till you're fairly bothered. Troth, he thinks the young one's doin' somethin' out of the way if he just walks down the street, and expects everybody to stand watchin' him goin' along. It's surprisin' the foolery there does be in people." "Och, murdher, woman alive," said Ody Rafferty, whose pipe went out at this moment, "there's no contentin' yous at all. It's too cute they are, and too foolish they are. Musha, very belike they're not so much off the common if you'd a trifle more experience of them. There's nothin' to match that for even in people. Bedad now, there's some people I know so well that I can scarce tell the one from the other." Lisconnel, however, generally declined to fall in with Ody's philosophical views, and the Patmans, whether suspected of excessive cuteness or folly, remained persistently unpopular. There was only one exception to this rule. The widow M'Gurk has a certain fibre of perversity in her, which sometimes twists itself round unlikely objects for no apparent reason save that they are left clear by her neighbours, and this peculiarity renders her prone upon occasion to undertake the part of devil's advocate. When, therefore, she had once delivered herself of the opinion that the newcomers were very dacint folks, she did not feel called upon to abandon it because it stood alone. As grounds for it, she commonly alleged that they were real hard working and industrious, which was obviously true enough, since Mrs. Patman and her sister might constantly be seen tilling their little field with an energy far beyond the capacity of its late tenant. Her neighbours' unimpressed rejoinder, "Well, and supposin' they are itself," did not in the least disconcert the widdy, nor yet their absence of enthusiasm when she stated that it was "a sight to behould Tishy M'Crum diggin' over a bit of ground. She'd lift as much on her spade as any two men. As for little Katty, she'd never seen anybody doin' anythin' agin the child. It might happen by nature to be one of those little crowls of childer that'd always look hungry like, and pinin' the crathurs if you were able to keep feedin' them with the best as long as the sun was in the sky." In short, something more than talk was usually needed to put the widow M'Gurk out of conceit with any notion she had taken up. Perhaps the comparative aloofness of her hillside cabin helped to maintain the Patmans at their original high level in her estimation. At any rate, they had not sunk from it by the time that they had been nearly 3 months in Lisconnel, and when Mrs. Patman and her sister were on terms of the very glummest civility with all the other women in the place. Even towards the widow M'Gurk they were tolerant rather than expansive. She said they done right enough not to be leapin' down people's throats. One morning, not long after Christmas, the widow, being bound on an errand down below, called in at the Patmans with a view to possible commissions. Meal was wanted, and while Tishy M'Crum stitched up a rent in the bag, Mrs. M'Gurk noticed, while little Katty, who had been took bad wid a cold these 3 days, rustled uncomfortably among wisps of rushes and rags in an obscure corner. Fever made her bold and self-asserted, for she was wishing nothing less than that her daddy would get her an orange wid yeller peel around it. Katty laid stress on this point, like the one her mammy got her a long time ago. And daddy'll be a good daddy and get her another now. And she'd keep a bit for Bobby and Hughie and all of them. A big yeller orange. Katty's eyes blazed with excitement as she reiterated these desires. "She's got an uncommon fancy for a one," said her daddy, looking wistfully from the child to his wife. "They have them down below," suggested the widow, "pence a piece." Mrs. Patman's hand was slipping towards her pocket. "If it was just for wunst," she had begun, when Tishy tweaked her sleeve viciously and interpolated a rapid whisper. "It won't be. There'll be no ind to it if you begin humourin' them." So the sentence was badly dislocated. "She'll do a deal better widout any such trash," said Mrs. Patman, and walked off to throw sods on the fire. Just then the widow became aware that old Joe Patman was grimacing at her from a corner fast by in a way which might have startled her had she not been familiar with such modes of beckoning. But when she obeyed his summons, what she saw astounded her outright, for Joe was stooping over a leathern pouch which he had drawn from a wall cranny, and which seemed to contain marvellous depths of silver money, with here and there a golden gleam among it, as he warily stirred it up, circling a hurried forefinger. She had only the briefest glimpse ere he shoved back the pouch and thrust a sixpence into her hand, muttering, "Git her an orange, don't be lettin' on for your life." As she turned away with a reassuring nod, she perceived that Tishy M'Crum was standing unexpectedly near, and looking towards them over the top of the meal bag. Tishy was biting off a loose end of thread, which gave her determined and ferocious expression, but whether she could have seen anything or not, the widow felt uncertain. She thought not. About 10 days after this, Mrs. M'Gurk was roused at a very early hour by a thumping on her door. When she opened it, she found some difficulty in recognising her visitor, as the dawn had scarcely done more than dim a few stars far away in the east, which is an ineffective form of illumination. "Whither now, Joe Pattern, is it yourself?" she said peeringly. "And what's brought you out at all afore you can see a step or a stim? Is the little girl took worse?" For Katty's illness still continued, and had grown rather serious. "Sure no," said the old man. "Katty's just pretty middlin', but it's waitin' I've been the len'th of the mornin' till 'twould turn broad daylight before I'd be disturbin' of you, ma'am, to tell you the quare sort of joke they're after playin' on me down yonder." "Saints above, man, what talk have you of jokin' at this hour of the day or night?" said Mrs. M'Gurk, feeling the unseasonableness acutely, as a bitter gust came swooping up the slope and indiscriminately ruffled the rime-dusted grass tufts and her old grizzled locks. "Och, be jabbers, it's a great joke they have agin me whatever," said old Patman, who was shivering much with cold partly, and partly perhaps with amusement. "You see the way of it was, last night, no great while after we'd all gone asleep, I woke up suddint, like as if wid the creak of a door or somethin', but whatever it might be, 'twas slipped beyond me hearin' afore I'd got me senses right. So I listened a goodish bit, and somehow everything seemed unnatural quiet, till I heard Katty fidgetin', and I went over to see would she take a drink of water. The Lord presarve us and keep us, ma'am, if all the rest of them hadn't quit out of it they have, and left us clever and clane." "And now don't be romancin', man," said the widow remonstrantly. "What in the name of the nation 'ud bewitch any people to go rovin' out of their house in the middle of the black night, wid the frost thick on the ground?" "Quit they are," said the old man. "Tom's gone, and the wife, and every man jack of them. They've took the couple of chuckens I noticed Tishy killin' of yisterday. Begorra, I believe they've took Tib the cat, for ne'er a sign of it I see about the place, that would be mostly sittin' cocked up on the dresser. Goodness guide us, sorra a soul there is in the house but the two of us, me and the child, and she's rael bad. It's a quare old joke." "It'd be a joke of a set of ravin' mad people," said the widow. "But the best of it is," he went on, "do you mind, ma'am?" He looked round him suspiciously and lowered his voice. "The leather pouch you might ha' seen me wid the other day?" "Oh," said Mrs. M'Gurk, "are they after takin' that on you? Sure, man, I thought you had it unbeknownst." "Aye, it's took," old Patman said, "but how she grabbed it I dunno, unless, I was thinkin', be any chance you mentioned somethin' about it." "Divil a bit of me did," averred the widow, with truth which her hearer accepted. "And how much might you have had in it at all?" "Troth, I couldn't be tellin' you," he said. "I never thought to count it. 'Tis just for the pleasure to meself I keep it. This long while back I've put ne'er a penny in it, but when we used to be livin' up at Portnafoyle, I'd slip in the old shillin's now and agin, and sometimes I'd think 'twould be handy for buryin' me, and other times I'd think I'd give it to Tom as soon as I'd gathered a trifle more. Only some way the thought of partin' wid it 'ud seem to go agin me, and since poor Tom made a match with Martha M'Crum, 'tis worse agin me it goes."
'Tis that good for nought weasel of a slavin' Tishy's after conthrivin' it on me," quoth the old man, with a sudden spasm of resentment. "Tom 'ud never play such a trick. I mane it wasn't he invinted the joke. He doesn't trouble himself much wid jokin'. He's too sensible and steady and perspicuous. And uncommon set on me and the child. There's no better son in Ireland. Och, but the rest of them mean no harm wid it. They're just schemin' to drop in presently and be risin' a laugh on me." Steps were promptly taken to verify old Joe Patman's strange story proved it to be correct in every particular. The only fresh fact which they brought to light was the presence of a 5 shilling piece lying on the dresser, where Joe had overlooked it in the early dusk. All the other inmates, chuckens and cat included, had disappeared, and with them most of the few movables. The old man and the sick child being left as forlorn fixtures. Lisconnel at large was neither slow nor circumlocutory in forming and expressing its opinion as touching the nature of the joke, a firm belief in which old Joe resolutely opposed to his troubles as they thickened around him. For no tidings came from the absentees, or were heard of them, while Katty's fever ran so high that it seemed likely he would be at small further charges on her account, a prospect which, however financially sound for a capitalist of 5 shillings or under, none the less filled his soul with grief. Then one night, when Katty was at her worst, a great gale came rushing and roaring across the bog, and when the day broke, it discovered the Patmans' brown thatch sloped, interrupted by a gaping crevasse, over which a quick plashing rain sheet quivered. The widow M'Gurk had less spare room than heretofore at her disposal now that she harboured a co-tenant, with a slight accession of tables and chairs. Yet she made out a dry corner for the child and her grandfather, who accepted these quarters in preference to any others, because the widow, whatever may have been her private views, was prevented by a mixture of contrariness and magnanimity from joining in the general denunciation of her former allies, compromising as were the circumstances under which they had elected to take their departure. In her society, therefore, he was not fain to overhear trenchant criticisms upon Tom's behaviour, and could dilate, at least uncontradicted, upon those gifts and graces in the young man which recent events had placed in some need of exposition. Other disquieting voices there were, however, which he could not dodge, and they spoke louder every day. For his 5 shillings were melting, dwindling, had vanished, and Lisconnel, with the best will in the world, could ill brook a burden of 2 incapables more laid upon its winter penury. No word on the subject had reached the old man's outer ears, but as Katty struggled slowly and fractiously towards convalescence, it became clearer in his mind that unless something happened, she must, when well enough to be moved, seek change of air away at the big house. Perhaps this prospect was more constantly before him than even the thought of Tom's filial virtues as he sat drearily on the bank of widow M'Gurk's door. He might often be seen to shake his head despondently, and then he was saying to himself, "Belike he thought bad of me keepin' the bit of money unbeknownst." By that time he had abandoned the joke theory, and fixed his hopes upon the arrival of a letter to explain the mysterious nocturnal flitting, and say whither they had betaken themselves after passing through Duffclane, the furthest point to which the detective forces of the district had tracked the party. Young Dan O'Beirne, whose work brought him daily up from down below to the forge half way towards Lisconnel, had safely promised to convey this letter so far whenever it came, and on many a day the neighbours nodded commiseratingly to one another as they saw the old crathur setting off wid himself in quest of it. The prompt January dusk would have already the prompt January dusk would have already fallen before he struggled up the knockawn, to be greeted by the widow in the tone of marked congratulation which our friends sometimes adopt when all reason for it conspicuously absent. "Well, man alive, there wouldn't be e'er a letter in it this day anyway." "Och, to be sure, not at all," he would answer cheerfully. "I wouldn't look to there bein' e'er one sooner than to morra. I hadn't the notion of expectin' a letter whatever. 'Twas just for the enjoyment of a bit of a walk I went." "Why, to be sure it was. But be comin' in, man, for you're fit to drop, and be gettin' your ould brogues dried. Och, man, you're drownded entirely. 'Tis a mighty soft evenin' it's turnin' out." "And here's Katty lookin' out for you this great while," Big Anne would say. "She's finely this night, glory be to goodness." Affairs were much in this posture when the widow was one day perplexed by the occurrence of two small incidents. In the first place, as she was starting on an expedition to the town, she saw at a little distance something running across the road, which looked uncommonly like the Patmans' black cat Tib. Lisconnel owns no other cats, for which she might have mistaken it. Still, as she was puzzled to look how the creature should have hidden itself away for more than a fortnight, she concluded that she had been deceived by some fluttering bird or glancing shadow. In the next place, she happened in the town upon one Larry Donnelly, who in the course of conversation remarked, "So you've that young Patman back wid yous agin. What took him to be leggin' off wid himself that way?" "And what put that in your head at all?" said the widow. "Light nor sight we've seen of him, or a one of them, or likely to. It's off out of the country he is belike, and he after robbin' his ould father, that never done talkin' foolish about him, and leavin' his innocent child to go starvin' into the Union, bad luck to him." She found a free expression of her sentiments rather refreshing after the restrictions under which she was placed at home. "Well now," said Donnelly, "I'd have bet me pair of best brogues I seen that chap a couple of nights ago streelin' along the road down about our place, but 'twas darkish enough, and I might aisy be mistook." The widow pondered much over this statement on her homeward way, but had the forbearance to say nothing about it. She was still undecided whether or no she would communicate it to anybody, when next morning on her way for a can of water, she saw the black cat, unmistakable this time, run across the road, and, as the day before, make off over the bog towards the little river. Widow M'Gurk stood staring after it for a few minutes, and came to a resolution. Then she looked about her, and was aware of Andy Sheridan's head leaning against his doorpost. Of Andy her opinion was, as we have seen, rather low, but she could descry no other person available for her purpose, so she called to him: "Andy, lad, I'm goin' after me two pullets that's strayed on me. Come and be givin' me a hand." Andy lounged over to her good naturedly, and they turned into the bog, where Ody Rafferty presently joined them. The widow thought her fowl might be among the broken ground where the stream runs at the back of the knockawn, and the three went in that direction. It was a mild, soft, grey morning, and they met with neither stir nor sound, till they came abruptly upon a grassy hollow, shut in by furzy banks, and fronted by the running water. And then the widow, who alone had been expecting the unexpected, uttered a suppressed screech, and said, "Och, boys dear, goodness gracious guide us." End of section 8. Section 9 of Irish Idylls by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 9. What they saw was the figure of a man in a long greatcoat, crouched all of a heap under the bank. Near him were ranged in a row half a dozen oranges, striking up a wonderful golden glow. A small grimy scrap of paper was spread out near them, covered with several piles of shillings and pennies and a silver thimble. Besides these, Tib the cat sat severely tucked up, apparently dissatisfied and irked by the situation. At the widow's exclamation, the man raised his head, and was seen to be Tom Patman, looking haggard and dazed, and as hollow-eyed as little Katty herself. Widow M'Gurk and Ody and Andy stood in a line facing him. "Whethen now, Tom Patman," said Ody, "and what might you be doin' wid yourself?" "I'm sittin' here," said Tom. "Och musha, tell us something we don't know then. Sittin' there you are, sure enough, but what the mischief are you after, might I politely ax, or what you mane by it, at all?" "I'm sittin' here," said Tom again, "and starvin' I am. And sittin' and starvin' I'll be more betoken till the end of me ould life. Sure what else 'ud I be doin', and meself to thank for it, wid never a soul left belongin' me in the mortal world, nor a place to be goin' to?" "Well, to be sure," said Mrs. M'Gurk, "if that talk doesn't beat all that ever I heard. And himself after traipsin' off as promiscuous as an ould hin that won't sit on her eggs, and lavin' his own flesh and blood behind him as if they were the dust on the road. And then he ups and gives chat about never a soul bein' left him." "'Twas Tishy bad cess to her," said Tom. "Och, but it's the mischievous ould divil skins is Tishy M'Crum. It's herself stirred up Martha, that wouldn't be too bad altogether if she'd be let alone, till the two of them had me tormented with tellin' me the ould man had pots of money he'd never spend as long as he had us to be livin' on, and that we'd all do a deal better if some of us slipped away aisy widout raisin' a row, and left him for a bit, while we'd be sellin' Martha's things and seein' about gettin' into a dacint little place, instead of the whole of us to be starvin' alive up at Lisconnel. That's nothin' more than a bog bewitched, and he after lettin' us be sold up, they said, and all the while ownin' mints of money, so that we'd no call to be overly particular about lavin' him to make a shift along wid the child, if 'twas a convenience, only he'd be risin' a quare whillabaloo if he knew we were goin' anywhere. Troth, I couldn't tell you the gabbin' they had day and night, and showin' me the place he kept his bag hidden in, and this way and that way. Och bedad, themselves 'ud persuade the hair on your head it grew wrong side out, if they'd a mind to it." "They might so," said Ody. "Supposin' I was great gomerel enough to be mindin' a word they'd say, or the likes of them." In his subsequent reports of the interview, Ody always alleged that he had replied, "Aye, very belike, supposin' it grew on the head of an ass," which was certainly neater. But Ody Rafferty's repartees, like those of other people, are occasionally belated in this way. "So the ind of it was," Tom went on, "nothin' else 'ud suit them except gettin' all readied up for us to be slinkin' out in the evenin' late. Faith, I'd 20 minds in me heart agin quittin' little Katty, and she that bad. Howanever, they swore black and white that me father'd be spendin' all manner of money on her when he got us out of it, and we were to be writin' to them to come after us as soon as we were settled and everythin' agreeable. So I went along. But if I did, ma'am, sure when they'd got the bits of furniture sold, the only notion they had was to be settin' off to make fortins in the States, and ne'er a word about Katty and the ould man. Och, they had me distracted, outrageous they were, and the old thief of the world, Tishy, allowin' me sorra a penny, so as I mightn't ha' been bound to stop where I was. But one day they thought they had me asleep in the room corner, and the two of them was colloguin' away at the table, so all of a suddint Tishy whips out me poor father's bag, that I knew the look of right well, when he used to keep his baccy in it, and down she slaps it, and it jingling wid money. 'What's that for you?' says she. And the laws bless us," said Martha, "is it after takin' that you are? And what's to become of them cratures up at Lisconnel?" "Och, blathers," said Tishy, "you needn't be lettin' on you didn't well know all this while I had it. Sure, the ould one might have plinty more hittin' on us. Anyway, I left them somethin' to get along wid," says she. "The 5 shillings," said the widow. "Och, but that one's a caution." "Rael hard workin' and industrious she is," observed Andy. "Them two do as well inside as out," says Tishy. "I'll just be countin' the bit of silver," says she. But bedad I was fairly past me patience, and up I leaps, and I grabbed a hould of the little bag. Och, it's a quare fright I gave them that time, and they not thinkin' I was mindin', rael terrified they were," said Tom, sitting up more erect and recalling this rare experience with evident complacency. "And lave that, you omadhawn," says Tishy, wid the look of a devil on her. "What foolery are you at now? You thievin' miscreant," says I, "it's shankin' off to the pólis I'll be, and layin' a heavy charge agin you for robbin' and stealin', and you after leavin' the child there and the ould man to starve widout a penny to their names," says I. "Phog," says she, "for that matter, the fever's liker to have took her off wid no trouble to be starvin', and maybe a good job too for everybody. And be this and be that," says I, "if I thought there was ever a fear of it, 'tis wringin' your ugly neck round I'd be this instinct." "Let go of that bag," says she, sweeping up some of the shillings that was spilt. "The pólis," says I, "and a heavy charge if there's another word out of your hijeous head." "I vow and declare," says Martha, "I believe 'twould be the cheapest thing we could do wid him to let him take it and go. Sure he'd be divil a ha'porth more use for an immigrant than the old cat there I was ape enough to bring along to pacify the childer." So then Tishy gave some more impudence, but the last end of it was we came to an agreement that I'd take the note and the silver, and they'd keep what bits of gold was in it, and they'd go off wid themselves wherever they pleased at all, and I'd tramp straight back here to be looking after the child and the old man. Ay, bedad, we settled it up civil enough, and afore I went Martha handed me out the old thimble and bid me bringin' it to Katty. "'Twas her mother's," says she, "I was keepin' for her, and thick it is wid holes be the same token, but don't say I be robbin' it off of her. And they told me to take Tib along, or else they'd be leavin' her to run wild. So I put her in the basket. Begorrah, I believe Hughey had a notion to be comin' wid me and the cat, for he was lettin' woful bawls the last thing I heard of him. So away I come wid the best of me haste. Och, I knocked the quare walkin' out of meself entirely, and I stopped at the last big place I was passin' to get Katty the oranges, and I was trampin' it all the night after, till just when there was a streak of the mornin' over the bog, I come into Lisconnel. But och, wirra the roof's off the house. Och, and look at the block hole wid the rafters stickin' through it, and ne'er a breath of smoke, till me heart was sick watchin' to see what might there be an odd one, and the door clappin'. Sure, be that I well knew the child was dead, and me father quit out of it, or maybe buried himself, and I after leavin' them dyin' and starvin'. So for afraid somebody be comin' out and tellin' me, off I run away into the bog, till I was treadin' here in the cold wather. And then I tumbled the old cat out of the basket that was scrawmin' and yowlin' desperate, and I slung the basket into the stream, there's the handle among them rushes, and down I set under the bank. I dunno how many nights and days it is at all. But here I stop, never a foot I stir to be lookin' for bite or sup, or lettin' on I'm in it. And anybody may take the bit of money and welcome. I'd as lief be pickin' up the dirt on the road, for I'll just give me life a chance to end out of the world's misery and desolation." "Now may goodness forgive you," said the widow M'Gurk. "It's a poor case to want the wit. Troth, and yourself's the quare ould child, a certain mane-spirited, aisy frightened slieveen of a young bosthoon. But what sort of a conthrivance is it you have on you at all, be way of a head, that you couldn't have the sinse to consider the roof blowin' off of a body's house 'ud be the raison enough for them to be quittin' out of it, and no sign of dyin' in the matter? D'you think the wind was apt to be waitin' till there happened to be nobody widin afore it got scatterin' the thatch? God help us all, you've little to do to be squattin' there talkin' about disolations and miseries, wid the two of them this instant minute sittin' be the fire up at my place, and sorra a hand's turned ailin' them, forby Katty's a trifle conthráry now and agin, though not bein' entirely strong yet. And bedad that hearin' reports of the occurrence used to proceed from this point, the lep he gathered himself up with, and the rate he legged it off, musha he was over the hill while we were pickin' up his things for him. And as for the old cat that he tipped over, it rolled a perch of ground before it got a hould of its 4 feet. Sure we were sittin' there as quite as could be consaved." The conclusion of this precipitate rush was thus recounted, when all of a sudden we couldn't tell what came bouncing in at the door, as if it had been shot out of the ends of the earth, and had us all jumping up and screeching, till we seen it was only Tom Patman, and he in such a takin' you might suppose he thought something 'ud swally up old Joe and the child on him before he could get at them. Lisconnel's opinion was divided as to whether Tom would actually have stayed and starved in his hiding place had he not been discovered. Mrs. M'Gurk thought it likely enough. The cat going back and forwards that way, she said, gave her an idea there was something amiss in it, and that was why she took Andy along. 'Deed, and she got a quare turn when first she spied the chap crouchin' under the bank. She couldn't tell but he might ha' been a corpse. Brian Kilfoyle's view was, "Divil a much. Sure if he'd had e'er a notion to be doin' anythin' agin himself, there was plenty of deep bog holes handy for him to sling himself into, and have done wid it." Whereupon Mrs. Sheridan crossed herself deprecatingly, and said, "Ah, sure, belike the crathur wouldn't have the wickedness in him to go do such a thing. Her husband didn't know but he might. Them soft sort of fellers 'ud sometimes stick to anything they took into their heads, the same as a dab of mortar agin a wall." And Ody Rafferty supposed the fact of the matter was that if be any odd chanst they got a notion of their own, they mistook it for somebody else's. On one point, however, the neighbours, Mrs. M'Gurk not excepted, were practically unanimous: the utter flagitiousness, namely, of Tishy M'Crum. There was a tendency to begrudge her the trivial merit of having voluntarily left behind her the 5-shilling piece, as this marred that perfect symmetry of iniquity which is so pleasant to the eye when displayed by people of whom we have no opinion. Only Mrs. Brian said it was a mercy she had that much good nature in herself, but even she added that the fewer of them kind of folk she saw comin' about the place, the better she'd be pleased, and she hoped they'd got shut of them for good and all. This aspiration seemed the more likely to be fulfilled when, within a week or so, the Patmans heard from the family of Tom's first wife, who held out prospects of work for himself and a home for his father and Katty, an offer which was gladly accepted. Their departure left at the single trace of their sojourn in Lisconnel Tib the cat, which remained behind, a somewhat unwelcome bequest to the widow M'Gurk. Indeed, I fear the creature became a source of some annoyance to her, because Andy Sheridan contracted a habit of addressing it by the name of Tishy, and bestowing upon it the same laudatory epithets with which the widow had been wont to justify her admiration for the energetic sisters. It was on a hushed February morning that the Patmans finally departed. The smell of spring was in the air, and filmy silvery mist had begun to float off the dark bogland in vanishing wreaths, soft and dim as the frail sloe blossom already stolen out over the withered black branches up on the ridge. A jewel had been left in the heart of every groundling trefoil and clover leaf, and the long rays that twinkled to them were still just tinged with rose. Here and there a flake of gold seemed to have lit upon the clump of sombre green furze bushes, by which neighbours in a small knot stood watching the 3 generations of Patmans dwindle away down the road with its narrow dewy grass border threading the vast sweep of sky-rimmed brown. Father and son walked while little Katty bobbed along balanced in a swaying donkey pannier. The widow M'Gurk, who felt a good deal of concern about the destiny of her late lodgers, hoped they were going to dacint people, for there wasn't as much sense among the 3 of them as you'd put on a 4-penny bit. And Mrs. Quigley thought 'twould be hard to say which, the young man or the old one, was the foolishest. For the blathers old Joe talked about Tom, and the gabby Tom made of himself over the child now that he had his own way with her was past belief. "And I can tell you," said Ody Rafferty, "there's folks goin' about that you'll want all the wits you ever had, and maybe somethin' tacked on, to get the better of rightly. Och, I question will they ever do any great things, goodness help them," said Mrs. Sheridan. "'Twill be much if he keeps them outside the house." "Well, anyway," said Biddy Ryan, "I'd liefer be in their coats, fortin or no fortin, than like them 2 ugly tempered women settin' off to the dear knows where after robbin' and plunderin' all before them." "True for you then, Biddy," said Mrs. Brian, turning away from her wide outlook. "We're none so badly off when we're stoppin' where we are, instead of streelin' about wid the notion of such villanies in our minds. For sure enough," she said as she faced round towards the grey peaked end walls and russet thatch of Lisconnel, "the world's a quare place to get travellin' through, take it as you will." End of Section 9. Recording by James Carson. End of Irish Idylls by Jane Barlow.